Hi, I'm Camila Torres. I stood in the gleaming showroom of Riverside Luxury Motors, my hands trembling as my sister Natasha's laughter echoed off the marble floors. Seriously, Cam? You drove that here? She sneered, pointing through the floor-to-ceiling windows at my weathered Honda Civic parked between two pristine BMWs. I'm embarrassed to be seen with you. And when the general manager, Mr. Harrison, approached us with that polished smile, ready to dismiss me as just another window shopper, my sister whispered loud enough for him to hear, "Don't waste your time. She drives a 15-year-old rust bucket." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But you know what's worse than being humiliated by your family in front of strangers? Discovering that the humiliation was just the tip of the iceberg, and that everything you thought you knew about your own life was a carefully constructed lie. And the moment Mr. Harrison pulled up my account on his computer and his face went completely white, everything changed. Before we dive in, what would you do if your family spent years making you feel worthless, only to discover they knew exactly how successful you really were? Let us know in the comments, because this is just the beginning. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook. I'd grabbed my usual coffee from Penny's Diner, the one on 5th Street, where the waitress Dorothy always remembered I liked extra cream and no sugar. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves from the residential streets that wound through our small Connecticut town. I'd driven my Honda, the same car I'd had since college, the one I'd maintained religiously despite its age, despite the small dent on the passenger door from when I'd hit that shopping cart 3 years ago. I loved that car. It had gotten me through nursing school, through my first job at Millbrook General, through every milestone of my adult life. Sure, the paint had faded from deep blue to something closer to gray, and yes, the air conditioning made that weird rattling sound when I turned it on high, but it was reliable, paid off, and it was mine. I'd never seen the point in buying something flashy when this car served its purpose perfectly. My phone had buzzed as I pulled into the hospital parking lot for my shift. A text from Natasha. "Meet me at Riverside Luxury Motors after work. Looking at cars. Need moral support." I'd stared at the message for a moment, surprised. My sister rarely asked for my company, especially not for something as significant as car shopping. We'd grown distant over the years, our relationship strained by what felt like constant competition on her part and constant criticism directed at my choices. But family was family. And despite everything, I wanted to be there for her. So after my 12-hour shift, a particularly brutal day in the ICU, where we'd lost Mr. Peterson, a sweet grandfather who'd reminded me of my dad, I'd driven the 20 minutes to the dealership, still wearing my scrubs, my hair pulled back in the messy bun that had become my signature look during long shifts. Riverside Luxury Motors was the kind of place I'd driven past 100 times, but never imagined stepping foot inside. The building was all glass and chrome, with sleek German engineering gleaming under strategic lighting that made every surface sparkle. Even the air inside smelled expensive. That new car scent mixed with leather and something that might have been imported coffee. Natasha was already there when I arrived, dressed in her perfectly tailored business suit, her blonde hair styled in those loose waves that looked effortless but probably took an hour to achieve. She worked in marketing for some tech company in Hartford, always talking about client dinners and networking events, always somehow making me feel like my job saving lives was somehow less important than her job selling software solutions. "There you are," she said when she spotted me walking through the entrance, her smile faltering slightly as she took in my appearance. "God, Cam, you look exhausted. And those scrubs." She wrinkled her nose like my work clothes personally offended her. I shrugged, too tired to take the bait. 12-hour shift. Sorry I didn't have time to change into designer clothes for your car shopping trip. That's when she looked past me, through those massive windows, and her expression shifted from mild disapproval to outright horror. Please tell me you didn't drive that thing here. I followed her gaze to my Honda, sitting innocently in the parking space I'd chosen, specifically because it was well lit and away from the more expensive cars. In the context of this showroom, surrounded by vehicles that cost more than I made in a year, my car did look shabby. But the way Natasha was looking at it, like it was roadkill that had somehow developed the ability to drive itself, made something hot and defensive rise in my chest. That's my car, Nat. The same car I've had for 8 years, the same car you've ridden in dozens of times.
Not here, she'd hissed, glancing around nervously as if the other customers might somehow associate her with my vehicle. This is embarrassing, Camila. What if someone sees us together? What if they think we're, I don't know, related? The irony of that statement, considering we were, in fact, sisters, wasn't lost on me. But before I could respond, a tall man in an expensive suit had approached us, his smile wide and practiced, the kind of expression that said he could smell a potential sale from across the room. Good evening, ladies. I'm James Harrison, General Manager here at Riverside. How can I help you today? Natasha had immediately brightened, extending her manicured hand with the confidence of someone who belonged in places like this. Hi, James. I'm Natasha Brennan. I called earlier about test driving the new E-Class. Of course, Ms. Brennan. I have your information right here. His attention had shifted to me, and I'd seen the subtle calculation in his eyes as he took in my scrubs, my tired face, my complete lack of jewelry beyond the simple watch my parents had given me for graduation. And you are? Before I could answer, Natasha had stepped slightly forward, creating a physical barrier between us. This is my sister. She's just observing. Don't worry about her. The dismissal in her voice had stung more than I'd expected, but it was Mr. Harrison's reaction that had really driven the knife home. His smile had dimmed noticeably, his attention already shifting back to Natasha, as if I had become invisible. Wonderful. Shall we start with the paperwork? And that's when Natasha had delivered the final blow, her voice carrying just far enough for the other customers to hear. Don't waste your time on her, Mr. Harrison. She drives a 15-year-old rust bucket, probably can't even afford the down payment on a used Corolla. The laughter from the other customers had been quiet but unmistakable. I'd stood there, feeling heat creep up my neck, wanting nothing more to disappear through the polished floor, because in that moment, surrounded by luxury I couldn't afford, and a sister who seemed ashamed of my very existence, I felt exactly like what they all thought I was, a failure. The humiliation burned deeper as I stood there in that pristine showroom, the weight of every judgmental stare pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The marble floor beneath my feet felt cold even through my nursing shoes, and I could hear the quiet murmur of other customers discussing lease terms and financing options, their voices mixing with the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Everything about this place screamed money, success, the kind of life I'd never thought I wanted until this moment when I felt so completely out of place. Natasha was already walking away with Mr. Harrison toward a gleaming silver Mercedes, her heels clicking confidently against the floor. She moved through the space like she owned it, her designer handbag swinging casually at her side, never once looking back to see if I was following. It struck me then how different we'd become, how the gap between us had widened over the years until we might as well have been strangers who happened to share the same parents. I watched as Mr. Harrison opened the driver's door of the Mercedes for her, his attention completely focused on his potential customer. The way he smiled at her, the way he gestured excitedly at the car's features, it was like I'd never existed. I was just the shabby sister in scrubs, The one who drives a rust bucket, the one who clearly didn't belong in a place where the cheapest car on the lot probably cost more than my annual salary. The thing was, I'd worked double shifts for 3 months straight to help Natasha with her security deposit when she moved to that fancy apartment in Hartford 2 years ago. She'd called me crying, saying she was short on cash, that this opportunity would change her career trajectory. I'd given her $4,000 without hesitation. Money I'd been saving for a vacation I'd never taken, for furniture I'd never bought, for a dozen small luxuries I'd denied myself because family came first. She'd never paid me back, never even mentioned it again. Standing there, watching her run her hands along the Mercedes, I remembered all the times I'd covered for her. The wedding gift for our cousin Rebecca that I'd bought and let her put her name on because she'd forgotten to shop for it. The Christmas presents for our parents that came from both of us, but were paid for entirely by me. The countless dinners where I'd somehow always ended up picking up the check because she'd forgotten her wallet or was between paychecks. And now here she was shopping for a car that cost more than I made in 6 months, acting like she'd never even met me before. Ma'am, a young salesman with perfectly styled hair and a nervous smile had approached me. His name tag read Kevin, and he looked like he'd just graduated college. Are you browsing today, or did you need directions to somewhere else? The question hit me like a slap. Even the junior staff could tell I didn't belong here. I could see it in his eyes. The same calculation I'd seen in Mr. Harrison's face, the quick assessment that determined I wasn't worth his time or effort. But Kevin was younger, newer, probably still required to be polite to everyone who walked through the door, even the obvious non-customers. I'm with her, I said, nodding toward Natasha, who was now sitting in the driver's seat of the Mercedes, adjusting the mirrors like she already owned it. Kevin followed my gaze, then looked back at me with obvious confusion. Oh, are you the cosigner? Cosigner. Like I was here to provide financial backing for my sister's purchase. Like I was the responsible one with good credit, while she was the dreamer who needed someone else to guarantee her loans. The assumption stung because it was so far from the truth of our relationship, so far from the reality of who had been supporting whom all these years. No, I said quietly, I'm just here for moral support. Kevin nodded, but I could see him glancing between Natasha and me, trying to figure out the connection. We looked nothing alike. She was tall and blonde, with sharp features and expensive clothes, while I was shorter, barker, wearing scrubs that had seen better days. To anyone looking at us, it would be impossible to believe we were sisters. Impossible to imagine we'd grown up in the same house, shared the same parents, once been close enough to share secrets and inside jokes. I pulled out my phone, more for something to do with my hands than any real need to check messages. The lock screen showed a photo of me and my colleague Jessica from last week's hospital charity drive, both of us grinning despite being exhausted from our shifts. We'd raised over $15,000 for the children's wing, money that would go toward new equipment and family support services. It had been one of the most rewarding days I'd had in months. But looking at that photo now, in this environment, it felt like a reminder of how different my world was from this one. Jessica and I celebrated victories measured in lives saved and families comforted. Natasha's world seemed to be measured in status symbols and appearances, in having the right car and wearing the right clothes and being seen in the right places. My phone buzzed with a text message from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman I'd been helping with her medications since her husband passed away last year. Camila, dear, thank you again for picking up my prescriptions. You're an angel. She'd included a photo of the apple pie she'd baked for me, sitting on her kitchen counter, wrapped in foil. Mrs. Chen reminded me of why I'd become a nurse in the first place, why I'd chosen a career that would never make me rich, but would let me make a difference in people's lives every single day. She reminded me that there were different kinds of wealth, different ways to measure success. But standing in that showroom, surrounded by gleaming metal and leather that cost more than most people's homes, those philosophical comforts felt thin and inadequate. Because the truth was, I was tired. Tired of working double shifts just to pay rent on a tiny apartment. Tired of driving a car that made embarrassing noises and left me stranded twice this year. Tired of watching my sister effortlessly navigate a world that seemed designed to keep people like me on the outside looking in. I thought about my parents, who'd passed away 5 years ago in a car accident that had changed everything. They'd been proud of both their daughters, proud of my dedication to helping others, proud of Natasha's ambition and drive. They'd never played favorites, never made either of us feel less valuable than the other. But they weren't here anymore to bridge the gap that had opened between us, to remind us that we were family, despite our differences. Watching Natasha test the Mercedes sound system, her face lit up with genuine joy, I wondered when we'd stopped being sisters and started being strangers. When had she begun to see me as an embarrassment rather than someone she'd once looked up to? When had I become the person she needed to distance herself from in order to maintain her image? The worst part was that I could see myself through her eyes in this moment. Tired, underdressed, driving a car that belonged in a junkyard rather than a luxury dealership parking lot. I could understand why she'd want to pretend we weren't related, why she'd want to keep me at arm's length. Understanding it didn't make it hurt any less, but I could see the logic in her cruelty. Mr. Harrison was walking back towards me now, his clipboard in hand, his smile polite but dismissive. "Ma'am, your sister's ready to take the Mercedes for a test drive. You're welcome to wait in our customer lounge. There's complimentary coffee and Wi-Fi." Customer lounge. Like I was a child who needed to be entertained while the adults conducted business. Like I was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person worthy of basic respect.
"Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I think I'll head home. Tell Natasha I hope she enjoys her test drive." I turned toward the exit, my keys already in my hand, eager to escape this place that had made me feel smaller than I'd felt in years. But as I pushed through the glass doors into the cool evening air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted tonight, that this humiliation was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning that was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. I made it halfway to my car before my phone started buzzing. Natasha's name flashed across the cracked screen, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd realized how badly she treated me. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe this was her way of making things right between us. I was wrong. "Where the hell did you go?" Her voice was sharp, irritated, like I was a pet that had wandered off without permission. In the background, I could hear the smooth purr of the Mercedes engine, which meant she was already on her test drive. "I told James I needed to call my sister, and he said you just left. Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" I stopped walking, my hand tightening around the phone. "How that makes you look?" "Yes, Camila, how it makes me look. I told him you were here for moral support, and then you just disappear? He's going to think I'm flighty, that I can't commit to a purchase. Do you know how much commission he stands to make on the sale?" Standing there in the parking lot, surrounded by cars that cost more than most people's houses, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not once in that entire conversation had she asked if I was okay. Not once had she acknowledged that she'd humiliated me in front of strangers, that she'd treated me like an embarrassment she needed to hide. Her only concern was how my leaving might affect her precious image with the sales manager. "Nat, you told him not to waste his time on me. You said I drove a rest bucket and couldn't afford a down payment on a used car. In front of everyone." There was a pause, and I could hear her turn signal clicking through the phone. "I was just being honest, Cam. You do drive an old car, and you are always complaining about money. I didn't think it would hurt your feelings so much." Didn't think it would hurt my feelings? Like casual cruelty was just another Tuesday for her. Like humiliating her sister was such a normal part of her routine that she didn't even consider the impact. The worst part was how matter-of-fact she's sounding, like she genuinely couldn't understand why I might be upset. "You know what, Natasha? You're right. I do drive an old car, and I am careful with money. But that's because I've been supporting both of us for years, while you've been playing dress-up with money you've borrowed and never paid back." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had that dangerous edge it got when she felt cornered. Oh, here we go. Saint Camilla and her martyr complex. Nobody asked you to give me that money, Cam. You offered, remember? And if you're so broke, maybe you should have thought about that before playing the generous big sister. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed her, almost let myself think that maybe I was being unreasonable, that maybe I had offered that money freely and had no right to resent how she'd used it. But then I remembered the tears in her voice when she'd called me that night 2 years ago, remembered how she'd begged me to help her, promised she'd pay me back as soon as her next promotion came through. I offered because you were crying and desperate and said you had nowhere else to turn. You said it was a loan, Natasha. You said... I said a lot of things. People say things when they're emotional. You're the one who chose to take it seriously. The line went quiet except for the sound of her driving, the gentle whoosh of expensive tires on smooth asphalt. I stood there in the dealership parking lot, holding my phone and trying to process what I'd just heard. My sister had just admitted, without a trace of shame, that she'd lied to me to get money. That my desperation to help her, my willingness to sacrifice my own financial security for her benefit, had been nothing more than a weakness she'd exploited. Anyway, she continued, her tone shifting back to casual irritation, I need you to come back inside. James wants to run some numbers, and it would look weird if you're not here. This is important to me, Cam. Can you please just put aside whatever drama you're having and be supportive for once?
Be supportive for once. As if the last 5 years of covering her expenses, lending her money, and swallowing my pride hadn't been supportive enough. As if showing up tonight after a 12-hour shift in the ICU wasn't supportive enough. As if standing there while she humiliated me in front of strangers was somehow failing to be adequately supportive? No. The word came out quieter than I'd intended, but it felt like the most honest thing I'd said in years. No? What do you mean, no? I mean, no, Natasha. I'm not coming back inside. I'm going home. Camila, don't be ridiculous. This is childish. So what if some people heard me make a joke about your car? It's not like I said anything that wasn't true. A joke. She was calling it a joke now, as if the humiliation I'd felt was just me being too sensitive to appreciate her humor, as if the looks of pity and amusement from the other customers had been my imagination, as if the way Mr. Harrison had dismissed me after her comment was just coincidence. It wasn't a joke, Nat. And even if it was cruel. You made me feel like garbage in front of a room full of strangers, and now you want me to come back and pretend everything's fine so you can buy a car you probably can't afford with money you've borrowed from people you have no intention of paying back? How dare you? Her voice was ice cold now, all pretense of sisterly affection gone. How dare you judge my finances when you're the one driving around in a car that's older than some of my coworkers? At least I have ambition, Camila. At least I'm trying to build something instead of just accepting mediocrity. There it was. The truth that had been lurking underneath all our interactions for years. In Natasha's mind, I wasn't just poor, I was pathetic. My career saving lives was mediocrity. My careful budgeting was weakness. My willingness to help her was just evidence of my own failure to achieve anything worth protecting. You know what, Natasha? You're right. I don't have ambition like yours. I don't want to impress strangers with expensive cars or live in apartments I can't afford. I'm perfectly happy with my mediocre life. Finally, some self-awareness. The casual cruelty of that response took my breath away. This wasn't anger or frustration talking. This was how she really saw me. This was what she really thought of the sister who'd dropped everything to help her whenever she called, who'd never once said no when she needed something, who'd sacrificed her own comfort and security to support Natasha's dreams. I'm hanging up now, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Enjoy your test drive. Camila, wait! I ended the call and immediately blocked her number. Then I stood there in the parking lot, shaking, as the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. It wasn't just the humiliation in the dealership or even the casual cruelty of her words. It was the realization that this was who my sister really was, who she probably always had been. The tears, the desperation, the promises to pay me back, it had all been an act designed to extract what she needed from me.
I thought about our parents, about how proud they'd been of both their daughters. I wondered what they would think if they could see us now, if they could hear how Natasha had just spoken to me. Would they be disappointed in her cruelty, or would they think I was being too sensitive, too dramatic? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It took me a moment to realize Natasha must have borrowed James Harrison's phone to message me. Stop being dramatic and get back here. People are staring. People were staring because she was sitting in a dealership texting frantically while the general manager waited to discuss financing options. People were staring because she looked exactly like what she was, a woman so self-absorbed that she couldn't understand why her sister might not want to be treated like garbage for her entertainment. I deleted the message without responding and climbed into my Honda. The familiar creak of the driver's seat, the way I had to jiggle the key just right to get it to turn, the faint smell of the vanilla air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror, it all felt like coming home after a long exile in a foreign country. As I drove out of the parking lot, I could see Natasha through the dealership's floor-to-ceiling windows. She was back inside, gesturing animatedly at James Harrison, probably making excuses for my absence, probably spinning some story about her dramatic sister who couldn't handle a little teasing. The sight of her there, in her element, surrounded by luxury she couldn't afford but was determined to have anyway, made something inside me break clean in half. 26 years of sisterhood, of shared childhood memories and inside jokes and mutual support, and it had come to this. Her buying a car she couldn't afford while calling me mediocre for living within my means. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much.
By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the tears had finally come. Not the angry tears I'd expected, but something sadder and more final. I was grieving the sister I'd thought I had, the relationship I'd believed was real, the family connection I'd been fighting to preserve all these years. But mostly, I was grieving the woman I'd been before tonight, the one who'd believed that love and loyalty and sacrifice meant something, the one who'd thought family was worth any price you had to pay to keep it intact. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that made me realize how deep the damage from last night actually ran. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, nursing my second cup of coffee and trying to process everything that had happened when my phone started ringing. The first call came from my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who lived in Boston and had always positioned herself as the family matriarch since our parents died. "Camila, honey, I just got off the phone with Natasha." Her voice had that careful, diplomatic tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in false concern. "She told me about what happened last night at the car dealership. I think maybe you owe her an apology." I set my coffee cup down harder than necessary, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table. I owe her an apology? "Well, yes, dear. She said you caused quite the scene, that you embarrassed her in front of the sales manager by storming out. She was just trying to include you in an important moment in her life, and you turned it into some kind of drama." The revisionist history was breathtaking. In Natasha's version of events, apparently, she'd been the gracious sister trying to share a special moment, while I'd been the unstable sibling who'd created unnecessary drama. There was no mention of the humiliation, the cruel comments about my car, or the way she'd dismissed me in front of strangers. "Aunt Linda, did she tell you what she said to me? Did she mention how she told the manager not to waste his time on me because I drive a rust bucket and couldn't afford a down payment?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear Linda calculating how to spin this information. "Oh, honey, I'm sure she was just teasing. You know how siblings are with each other. Sometimes what sounds harsh to outsiders is just how families communicate." Teasing. The same word Natasha had used. Apparently, public humiliation was just another form of sisterly bonding that I was too sensitive to appreciate. I wondered if Linda would call it teasing if someone had spoken about her daughter that way, if she'd be so quick to excuse cruelty when it wasn't directed at someone else's child. Besides, Natasha has been doing so well for herself lately. That new apartment, the promotion at work, we're all very proud of her success. Maybe instead of being resentful, you could try to be more supportive. Supportive.
There was that word again. As if 5 years of financial support, emotional availability, and personal sacrifice hadn't been supportive enough. As if the fact that I drove an older car somehow negated every time I dropped everything to help my sister when she called. The second call came from my cousin Derek, Natasha's longtime friend who'd always taken her side in family disputes. His approach was more direct, less diplomatic than his mother's had been. "Cam, what's your problem? Natasha said you went completely psycho at the Mercedes dealership last night. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" "Derek, she humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers. She told them I was too poor to afford—" "Dude, you do drive a pretty beat-up car. It's not like she was lying. And since when are you so sensitive about money anyway? You're always saying you don't care about material things." The logic was twisted but effective. Because I'd chose a practical lifestyle, because I'd prioritized financial responsibility over status symbols, I was somehow not allowed to be hurt when my sister used my choices as ammunition to humiliate me. Because I'd claimed not to care about expensive things, I had forfeited the right to basic respect and dignity. It's not about the car, Derek. It's about how she treated me. Look, maybe she could have been nicer about it, but you're making way too big a deal out of this. She's trying to move forward with her life, trying to improve her situation, and you're dragging her down with all this negative energy. Can't you just be happy for her success? Happy for her success. Success that had been partially funded by money she'd borrowed from me and never repaid. Success that apparently gave her the right to look down on the sister who'd helped make it possible. I was supposed to celebrate her achievements while accepting my role as the family disappointment. The cautionary tale of what happened when you lacked ambition.
The third call was the worst. It came from my cousin Maria, who'd always been the family peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and keep everyone happy. I'd expected her to be more understanding, more willing to see both sides of the situation. "Camila, I know you're upset, but family is family. Whatever happened between you and Natasha, it's not worth destroying your relationship over. She's really hurt that you blocked her number." "She's hurt? Maria, did you hear what actually happened or just her version?" "I heard that there was some miscommunication at a car dealership and now you're not speaking to each other." "Look, I don't need to know all the details. What I know is that life is short and family is all we have. Your parents wouldn't want you two fighting like this." Bringing up our dead parents was a low blow, but an effective one. Maria knew exactly which buttons to push, knew that the guilt about disappointing our parents' memory would hit harder than any other argument she could make. The implication was clear. By refusing to reconcile with Natasha, I was dishonoring our parents' wishes for their daughters to stay close. "Maybe you should think about what's really important here," Maria continued. "Natasha is doing well, she's moving up in the world, and she wants to share that success with her family. Instead of being bitter about your own situation, maybe you could try to learn from her example." Learn from her example. The example of borrowing money you never intended to repay, of humiliating family members to impress strangers, of treating loyalty and sacrifice as weaknesses to be exploited. According to my family, this was success worth emulating? By the time the fourth call came, this one from my Uncle Robert, who wanted to lecture me about gratitude and family loyalty, I'd stopped answering. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone as it buzzed with increasingly judgmental voicemails, and tried to understand how I'd become the villain in this story. The pattern was consistent across every conversation. Natasha's cruelty was minimized, dismissed as teasing or honesty, or just how siblings communicate. My hurt was characterized as oversensitivity, drama, or jealousy of her success. The financial support I'd provided over the years was either forgotten or reframed as voluntary gifts that came with no expectation of gratitude, and my decision to remove myself from a humiliating situation was painted as abandonment, selfishness, or mental instability. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative had been established and how uniformly it was being repeated.
Within 12 hours of our confrontation, Natasha had successfully positioned herself as the victim and me as the unstable sister who couldn't handle her success. She'd rallied the entire family to her cause, and they'd accepted her version of events without question, without even asking to hear my side of the story. I realized that this wasn't really about last night at the dealership. This was about years of family dynamics that I'd been too naive or too hopeful to see clearly. I'd been cast in the role of the supporting character in Natasha's success story, the reliable sister who could be counted on to provide help when needed and stay quietly in the background when not needed. Any attempt to step outside that role, to assert my own worth or demand basic respect, was immediately met with pushback designed to put me back in my place. The most painful part wasn't even the family's reaction. It was the realization that this pattern had been in place for years, and I'd been complicit in maintaining it. Every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace, every time I'd provided financial support without asking uncomfortable questions, every time I'd accepted less than I deserved because family is family, I'd been reinforcing the very dynamic that had led to last night's humiliation. I thought about calling in sick to work, about pulling the covers over my head and hiding from this new reality where my own family had turned against me for refusing to accept abuse. But then I remembered Mrs. Chen's apple pie, remembered the thank you card from the families whose father I'd helped save last week, remembered all the ways my life had meaning and value that had nothing to do with my sister's opinion or my family's approval. So instead, I got dressed, drove my supposedly embarrassing Honda to the hospital, and threw myself into my work. At least there, my worth was measured by my competence and compassion, not by the car I drove or my willingness to tolerate mistreatment from people who were supposed to love me. But even as I tried to focus on my patients, on the life and death decisions that made family drama seem petty by comparison, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The safety net I'd always believed existed, the assumption that family would support you when the world turned against you, had been revealed as an illusion. I was more alone than I'd ever realized, and the people I'd counted on most had not only failed to catch me when I fell, but had actively pushed me off the cliff.
3 days later, I was standing in line at Penny's Diner, the same place I'd grabbed coffee before this whole nightmare began, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Excuse me, aren't you the woman who was at Riverside Luxury Motors on Tuesday evening?" I turned around to find a man I vaguely recognized. Mid-50s, silver hair, wearing a casual polo shirt and khakis that somehow managed to look expensive despite their simplicity. It took me a moment to place him, and then I remembered. He'd been one of the customers in the showroom that night, sitting in the waiting area while someone, probably his wife, looked at cars. He'd been close enough to witness Natasha's performance, close enough to hear every cruel word. My face burned with embarrassment as the memory flooded back. "Yes, that was me," I said quietly, hoping this wouldn't turn into another humiliation. Maybe he wanted to tell me how inappropriate my behavior had been, how I disrupted the sophisticated atmosphere of the dealership with my drama. But his expression was kind, almost concerned. "I'm Thomas Hartwell. I couldn't help but overhear what happened that night, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Would you mind if I bought you a coffee? I'd like to talk to you about something." Everything in me wanted to say no, to politely decline and disappear back into my normal routine where strangers didn't approach me with mysterious requests for conversation. But there was something in his tone, something genuine and non-threatening that made me hesitate. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mr. Hartwell. I think I've had enough public humiliation for 1 week." He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that seemed authentic. "Actually, I think you might be surprised by what I have to say. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. And please, call me Thomas." Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. We ordered our coffee and found a corner booth away from the morning rush of construction workers and early commuters. Thomas stirred sugar into his coffee methodically, choosing his words carefully before he spoke. "What I witnessed the other night wasn't right," he said simply.
The way your sister spoke to you, the way that sales manager dismissed you, it bothered me enough that I've been thinking about it for 3 days. I stared down at my coffee cup, not sure how to respond. It's just family drama. These things happen. No, he said firmly, but not unkindly. Those things don't just happen, or they shouldn't anyway. I've been in business for 30 years, and I've seen plenty of people use cruelty to make themselves feel important. What your sister did was calculated, designed to elevate herself by diminishing you. That's not normal family dynamics. That's bullying. The word hit me like a physical blow. Bullying. I'd never thought of it that way, never labeled Natasha's behavior so directly. But hearing it said out loud by a complete stranger who had no agenda, no family loyalty to protect, made something click into place. The thing is, Thomas continued, I don't think you deserve that treatment. And I don't think the story ends there. People who are willing to humiliate their own family members in public usually have more secrets than they're letting on. I looked up at him then, studying his face. Why do you care? You don't even know me. You're right, I don't know you, but I know what it looks like when someone is being treated unfairly, and I know what it feels like to have family members who see you as less than you are. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. My brother spent 20 years telling me I'd never amount to anything because I didn't have a college degree. Told everyone in our family that I was the failure, the one who couldn't get his life together. Meanwhile, he was living in a house I'd helped him buy, driving a car I'd co-signed for, sending his kids to private school with money I'd loaned him. The parallels were so obvious that they made my chest tight. What happened? Eventually, the truth came out. Turns out my successful brother had been using my financial backing to create an illusion of success while painting me as the family disappointment. When people found out that the failure had actually been supporting the success story all along, it changed everything. Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to me. Hartwell Automotive Solutions, fleet management and corporate leasing. I own one of the largest fleet management companies in New England, he said simply. We provide vehicles for corporations, government agencies, medical facilities. Last year, we managed over 4,000 vehicles across 6 states. I stared at the card, trying to process what he was telling me. I don't understand. Why are you telling me this? Because I think there's more to your story than meets the eye. The way you carry yourself, the way you talked about your work at the hospital. You don't strike me as someone who would choose to drive an old car unless there was a good reason for it. And based on what I witnessed the other night, I'm guessing that good reason has something to do with supporting family members who don't appreciate the sacrifice.
My hands were shaking slightly as I set down my coffee cup. Even if that were true, what difference would it make? My family has already decided I'm the problem. The difference, Thomas said, leaning forward slightly, is that sometimes the truth has a way of coming out at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the people who've been underestimating you get a wake-up call they never saw coming. I still don't understand why you're involved in this. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the table. My wife was in the showroom that night, too. She was looking at a car for our daughter's 16th birthday. When we got home, she couldn't stop talking about what we'd witnessed. She said it reminded her of how her own sister used to treat her before we got married. Always making her feel small, always suggesting she wasn't good enough. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair, standing next to a young girl who looked like a younger version of her mother. Margaret, my wife, she said something that night that stuck with me. She said, that woman in the scrubs probably saves lives every day, and her sister made her feel worthless for driving a practical car. There's something wrong with that picture. I felt tears prick at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Your wife sounds like a very wise woman. She is, and she's also the one who suggested I look into something that's been bothering me since Tuesday night. Thomas pulled a folder from the messenger bag he'd been carrying and placed it on the table between us. Tell me, Camila, and I hope you don't mind that I asked around to get your name. Do you happen to know anything about the medical transportation contracts for Millbrook General Hospital? The question came out of nowhere, and I blinked in confusion. Medical transportation? You mean the ambulances?
No, not emergency vehicles. I'm talking about the fleet vehicles used by medical professionals for home visits, patient transport, medical supply delivery, the cars and vans that hospitals lease for their staff to use for off-site medical services. I know about those. Our hospital has a whole fleet of vehicles for the community health program. I've used them for home visits to elderly patients, for transporting medical equipment to satellite clinics. Why? Thomas opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside were documents, contracts, payment schedules, all bearing the letterhead of Millbrook General Hospital. According to these records, your hospital has been leasing vehicles from Hartwell Automotive Solutions for the past 6 years. And according to our records, those contracts were negotiated by and are managed by someone named C. Torres. The blood drained from my face as I stared at the documents. That's impossible. I don't handle vehicle contracts. I'm a nurse, not an administrator. C. Torres, listed as Director of Community Health Services, Millbrook General Hospital. Someone who negotiated very favorable terms for the hospital, I might add. Someone who clearly knows the medical field well enough to specify exactly which types of vehicles would be most appropriate for different types of patient care. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There has to be some mistake. I'm not the Director of Community Health Services. I don't negotiate contracts. I just use the vehicles when I need to make home visits. Thomas was watching my face carefully, and I could see something like satisfaction in his expression. Camila, I think there are some things about your own career that you might not be fully aware of, things that someone might have been managing behind the scenes, possibly taking credit for your work. The folder contained more documents, performance reviews, budget proposals, program development plans, all signed by C. Torres, all dealing with the community health program I'd been running informally for years, organizing home visits and patient outreach without any official recognition or additional compensation. I don't understand, I whispered, but even as I said it, pieces were starting to fall into place. The way my supervisor always seemed to know exactly which patients needed home visits, the way the hospital's community outreach program had expanded over the years, always following suggestions I'd made in staff meetings, the way other departments had started asking for my input on patient care protocols. Camila, Thomas said gently, I think someone at your hospital has been using your ideas, your work, and possibly even your identity to advance their own career, and I think it's time you found out exactly what's been happening in your name. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside Millbrook General Hospital, staring at the documents Thomas had given me and feeling like my entire world was tilting on its axis. The folder contained 6 years of contracts, correspondence, and program proposals, all bearing my name in a professional capacity I'd never officially held. But the more I read, the more familiar the content became. These weren't just random administrative documents. They were my ideas, my suggestions, my patient care protocols, written up in formal business language and submitted as official hospital policy. I thought back to all the staff meetings where I'd spoken up about improving patient care, all the times I'd suggested new approaches to community outreach, all the informal leadership I'd taken in organizing home visits and coordinating care for underserved populations. Apparently, someone had been taking careful notes and turning my contributions into official proposals that advanced their own career. My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor, Dr. Patricia Walsh. Can you come to my office when you get a chance? Need to discuss some upcoming changes to the community health program. The timing felt like more than coincidence. I gathered the documents, took a deep breath, and walked into the hospital with a new sense of purpose. For the first time in days, I wasn't thinking about Natasha's cruelty or my family's betrayal. I was thinking about 6 years of my professional life that had apparently been stolen from me, and I was angry. Dr. Walsh's office was on the 3rd floor, a spacious room with diplomas covering one wall and family photos scattered across her desk. She'd been my supervisor for 4 years, and I'd always respected her, trusted her, even considered her something of a mentor. Now, looking at her sitting behind that large oak desk, I wondered what else I'd been naive about. Camila, please sit. I wanted to talk to you about the community health director position that's opening up. I think you'd be perfect for it, and I'd like to recommend you for the promotion. Community health director. The position I'd apparently been doing for years without knowing it, without compensation, without recognition. I set the folder on her desk and watched her face carefully. Dr. Walsh, before we discuss any promotion, I think we need to talk about these documents.
Her eyes flicked to the folder, and I saw something, a flash of surprise, maybe panic, cross her face before she composed herself. "I'm not sure what you mean, Camila. What documents?" I opened the folder and spread out the contracts, the correspondence, the program proposals. These documents, all signed by C. Torres, Director of Community Health Services, a position that, according to my employment records, I've never officially held. Dr. Walsh picked up one of the contracts, scanning it quickly. Her face had gone pale, but she was still trying to maintain her composure. "Camila, I think there might be some confusion here. These look like administrative documents. I'm not sure why you're showing them to me." "The confusion is mine, Dr. Walsh. For 6 years, I've been organizing community outreach, developing patient care protocols, and managing relationships with outside vendors, all while thinking I was just doing my job as a staff nurse. What I didn't realize was that someone was taking my work, formalizing it, and using it to create an entire department that I was supposedly directing." I pulled out the vehicle contracts with Hartwell Automotive Solutions, the ones that showed detailed specifications for medical transport vehicles, requirements that could only have been written by someone with extensive field experience in patient care. These contracts show that C. Torres has been managing a multi-million-dollar vehicle fleet for this hospital. The specifications are incredibly detailed, showing intimate knowledge of patient needs, mobility requirements, and medical equipment transport. Tell me, Dr. Walsh, who do you think has that kind of hands-on experience? Dr. Walsh set down the documents and leaned back in her chair. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I could see her calculating her next move. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Camila, you're a valuable member of our team, and your contributions to the community health program have been significant. But I think you're misunderstanding how hospital administration works. These contracts and proposals go through multiple departments, multiple approvals. No single person can take credit for—" "Dr. Walsh," I interrupted her, my voice sharper than I'd ever used with a supervisor. "I wrote these proposals. I specified these vehicle requirements. I developed these patient care protocols. The only thing I didn't do was sign my name to them and claim credit for creating a department worth millions of dollars to this hospital." She was quiet again, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she sighed and rubbed her temples. "The hospital needed someone with administrative credentials to interface with vendors and insurance companies. You're an excellent nurse, Camila, but you don't have an MBA. You don't have the educational background that companies like Hartwell Automotive Solutions require for their business partnerships. So you used my name and my work, but gave someone else the credit and compensation? The work was always collaborative. You provided valuable input, but it took administrative expertise to turn your suggestions into viable programs." Administrative expertise, as if organizing complex patient care schedules, coordinating with multiple medical professionals, and managing relationships with dozens of community partners wasn't administrative work? As if the detailed knowledge required to specify medical transport vehicles was somehow less valuable than an MBA degree? Who has been receiving the salary for the Director of Community Health Services position? Her silence was answer enough. I thought about her recent home renovation, the European vacation she had taken last summer, the new car she had been driving, all funded, apparently, by a position that existed because of my work, my ideas, my relationships with community partners.
Dr. Walsh, I need you to explain to me how someone can hold a director-level position at this hospital for 6 years without knowing about it. Camila, you're getting worked up over nothing. You've been compensated fairly for your nursing duties. The administrative work is separate, and the administrative work is my nursing duties. Every home visit I've organized, every patient transport I've coordinated, every community partnership I've developed, that's all been part of what you've been calling the Director of Community Health Services position. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken of the documents. I've already sent copies of these to someone who understands business contracts better than I do. He's very interested in how a hospital has been claiming to have a community health director who was unaware of her own position. Dr. Walsh's composure finally cracked. Camila,
Please don't do anything rash. We can work this out. The promotion I mentioned, we can make it official. Retroactive compensation, full administrative credentials. Retroactive compensation for 6 years of director-level work? For programs that have generated millions in revenue for this hospital? For partnerships that have improved patient outcomes and reduced readmission rates? We can discuss the details, but please, let's handle this internally. Getting outsiders involved won't benefit anyone. Getting outsiders involved? Like Thomas Hartwell, whose company had been paying the hospital for vehicle management services that I'd been providing without compensation? Like the state medical board, which might be interested to know how a hospital had been misrepresenting its administrative structure to vendors and insurance companies. I stood up, gathering the documents back into the folder. Dr. Walsh, I think this conversation is over. I'll be speaking with a lawyer about how to proceed. Camila, wait, let's not let this get out of hand. You're a valued employee, and we don't want to lose you over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that lasted 6 years and generated millions of dollars for the hospital while I drove a 15-year-old Honda because I thought I was just a staff nurse who couldn't afford better? I walked toward the door, then turned back. You know what the worst part is, Dr. Walsh? It's not even the money, though that's significant. It's that I spent 6 years thinking I was just doing my job, just being helpful, just contributing where I could. I never thought to ask for recognition or advancement because I didn't realize I was already performing at a director level. You let me believe I was ordinary when I was actually running a multi-million-dollar department. Camila, and the really devastating part? My own family has been treating me like a failure, like someone with no ambition, like someone who settles for mediocrity. My sister humiliated me in public because she thought I was too poor and unsuccessful to belong in her world. Meanwhile, I was unknowingly managing programs that dwarf her entire annual salary. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'll be taking some personal time while I figure out how to handle this situation. I assume the community health department can function without its director for a few days, since apparently it's been running itself all this time. As I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I could hear Dr. Walsh calling my name, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in my adult life, I understood exactly what I was worth, and I was done accepting less than I deserved from anyone, family, employers, or anyone else who thought they could diminish me to elevate themselves. 2 hours later, I found myself sitting in Thomas Hartwell's office, a sprawling corner suite on the 15th floor of a glass building overlooking Hartford's business district. The view was spectacular. You could see for miles across the Connecticut River Valley, but I was too overwhelmed to appreciate the scenery. The documents, spread across his mahogany conference table, told a story that was still hard for me to believe, even with the evidence right in front of me. 6 years, Thomas said, shaking his head as he reviewed the hospital contracts. 6 years of managing our medical fleet partnership, and you had no idea you were listed as the primary contact and decision maker? Margaret Hartwell sat beside me, offering me a cup of tea with the kind of maternal warmth I hadn't felt since my own mother died. She was exactly as I had imagined from Thomas's description: kind eyes, graying hair, and an immediate way of making you feel like you'd been friends for years instead of having just met an hour ago. Honey, Margaret said gently, what they did to you isn't just unethical, it's illegal. Using your identity for contracts, taking compensation for work you performed, misrepresenting the hospital's administrative structure to vendors and insurance companies? This could result in serious charges. Thomas nodded, pulling out a thick file folder. What's particularly interesting is how sophisticated your contract negotiations were. Look at these amendments from 3 years ago. He pointed to a series of documents covered with detailed annotations. You renegotiated our entire service agreement to include specialized equipment for pediatric transport, modified vehicle specifications for elderly patients with mobility issues, and added clauses for emergency medical supply delivery. This isn't work someone could fake or delegate. It requires intimate knowledge of patient care and medical logistics.
I stared at the documents, memories flooding back. 3 years ago, we'd had a series of difficult cases. Elderly patients who couldn't safely travel in standard vehicles, children who needed specialized car seats for medical transport, emergency situations where our regular supply chain had failed. I'd spent weeks researching solutions, making phone calls, working with vendors to develop better protocols. I'd thought I was just doing my job, going above and beyond to solve problems as they arose. I remember making those calls, I said quietly. There was an 8-year-old patient, Lucy Chen, no relation to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who needed regular dialysis treatments, but her grandmother's car wasn't safe for medical transport. I spent hours working out the logistics for a specialized vehicle with medical monitoring equipment. According to our records, C. Torres personally negotiated a custom vehicle modification that cost $32,000. The hospital was billed for the upgrade, and it's been part of their fleet ever since. Did you ever see any documentation of that purchase? I shook my head. I just knew that suddenly we had a vehicle that could safely transport pediatric patients to dialysis. I thought the hospital had decided to upgrade our fleet. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. Camila, that kind of specialized medical knowledge, combined with budget management and vendor negotiation skills, represents a very specific and valuable skill set. People with your expertise typically earn 6-figure salaries plus benefits. 6 figures? The number felt impossible. I make $48,000 a year as a staff nurse. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. Thomas cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with what he was about to say. Camila, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you ever heard the name Torres Associated Medical Consulting? I shook my head. No, should I have? Thomas opened another file, this one significantly thicker than the hospital contracts. Torres Associated Medical Consulting has been one of our largest clients for the past 4 years. They're a medical consulting firm that specializes in healthcare logistics, patient transport systems, and medical facility optimization. They manage vehicle fleets for 17 hospitals across New England. He spread out a series of contracts, invoices, and correspondence. All of it bore the letterhead of Torres Associated Medical Consulting, and all of it was signed by C. Torres, president and founder. This consulting firm generates approximately $2.3 million in annual revenue. They've won awards for innovative patient care solutions and have been featured in 3 major healthcare industry publications for their work in community health optimization. The room felt like it was spinning. I don't understand. Are you saying someone is using my name to run a consulting business? What I'm saying, Thomas said carefully, is either there's another C. Torres with your exact expertise and approach to medical logistics, or someone has been using your identity to build a multi-million-dollar business while you've been earning a staff nurse's salary. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Sweetheart, I think you need to understand something about your own value. The work you've been describing, the patient care innovations, the logistics coordination, the vendor management, that's not nursing. That's executive-level healthcare administration. But I don't have an MBA. I don't have business training. I'm just a nurse who cares about her patients. Some of the most successful business people I know don't have MBAs. What they have is real-world experience, problem-solving skills, and the ability to see solutions that others miss. From what I've seen of your work, you have all of that in abundance. Thomas pulled out his laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a website for Torres Associated Medical Consulting. The company profile described C. Torres as a visionary leader in healthcare logistics with over 6 years of experience in medical fleet management and patient care optimization. The testimonials page featured quotes from hospital administrators praising C. Torres for innovative solutions, cost savings, and improved patient outcomes.
One testimonial from the CEO of Hartford Regional Medical Center read, "C. Torres transformed our patient transport system, reducing costs by 30% while improving safety ratings across all metrics. Her expertise in medical logistics is unmatched in the industry." "This is impossible," I whispered, staring at the screen. "How can someone build an entire business using my name and my work?" "More easily than you'd think," Margaret said, "especially when the real C. Torres is too modest to realize her own worth, too trusting to question why she's never been properly compensated for director-level work." Thomas closed the laptop and leans back in his chair. "Camila, I've been in business for 30 years, and I've never seen someone more thoroughly exploited than you've been. Not only has your hospital been stealing your work and compensation, but someone has been using your expertise to build a consulting empire while you believed you were just a regular nurse." "But who would do this? Who even has access to my work and my ideas?"
That's what we need to figure out. But based on the timeline and the intimate knowledge of your specific innovations, it has to be someone with close access to your professional activities, someone who could observe your work and turn it into formal business proposals. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "There's something else you need to know, honey. Thomas didn't just invite you here out of kindness. Well, not entirely." Thomas nodded, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Margaret's right. I have a confession to make. After I met you at the diner, I did some research into Torres Associated Medical Consulting. What I found was so impressive that I've been trying to figure out how to approach C. Torres about a potential business partnership." "A partnership?" "Our companies have been working together for 4 years, but always through intermediaries and formal contracts. I've wanted to meet the person behind Torres Associated to discuss expanding our collaboration, maybe even exploring a merger of our medical logistics divisions." Margaret turned back from the window, smiling. "What my husband is trying to say is that he's been hoping to meet C. Torres because he considers her the most innovative medical logistics consultant in New England. Imagine his surprise when he realized that C. Torres is a woman who drives a 15-year-old Honda and has no idea she's running a multi-million-dollar business." I felt tears starting to well up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in my adult life, I was beginning to understand what I was actually worth, what I'd actually accomplished. The picture that was emerging wasn't of a mediocre nurse who couldn't afford a decent car. It was of a healthcare executive whose innovations had saved hospitals millions of dollars and improved patient care across multiple states. "Thomas," I said slowly, "what would happen if the real C. Torres wanted to take control of her own business?" His smile was answer enough. "I think that would be very interesting indeed. And I think whoever has been stealing from you is about to have a very bad week." The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, all from various family members. The discovery about my stolen professional identity had given me a strange sense of clarity, but apparently, word of my erratic behavior had spread through the family network faster than I'd anticipated. The first voicemail was from Aunt Linda, her voice tight with concern that sounded more like irritation. "Camila, Derek told me you've been telling people some wild story about being a secret business owner. Honey, this is exactly the kind of delusion that happens when people have mental health crises. Natasha is worried sick about you." Mental health crisis. That was their explanation for everything. Anytime I stood up for myself, anytime I questioned their narrative, anytime I refused to accept their version of reality, it was evidence of instability rather than evidence that I'd finally found my backbone. The second voicemail was from Derek himself, and his tone was harsher. "Cam, Mom called Natasha and told her you've been making up stories about running some $1 million company. Seriously, this is embarrassing for everyone. You need to get some help before you completely lose touch with reality. But the third voicemail made my blood run cold. It was from Natasha, and her voice had that same calculated sweetness she'd used as a child when she wanted something. Hi, Sissy. I heard you've been having a rough week, and I feel terrible about our misunderstanding at the dealership. I think we both said some things we didn't mean, and I'd really like to clear the air. I'm actually planning to stop by your apartment this afternoon with Derek and Aunt Linda. We're all concerned about you, and we think it might be good to have a family intervention. You know how much we love you, right? We just want to make sure you're okay. Family intervention. The word sent a chill down my spine. In our family, interventions weren't about love and support. They were about control and manipulation, about forcing the non-conforming member back into line. I remember when they'd staged an intervention for my cousin Sarah when she'd decided to leave her abusive husband. They'd spent 3 hours telling her she was being dramatic, that she needed to try harder to make her marriage work, that divorce would embarrass the family. Sarah had stayed in that marriage for 2 more years before finally finding the courage to leave again. I was still processing the voicemails when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Millbrook General Administration. Miss Torres, this is Janet Mills from Human Resources. We need you to come in this morning to discuss some irregularities in your employment records. Can you be here by 10? Irregularities. Dr. Walsh had obviously escalated the situation, probably trying to control the narrative before I could expose what had been happening. I glanced at the clock. It was already 9:15. I'll be there, I said, already reaching for my car keys. The drive to the hospital felt different this time. Instead of the automatic anxiety I usually felt when called to HR, I felt something closer to anticipation. For the first time in my professional life, I knew exactly what I was worth, and I wasn't going to let anyone diminish that value.
Janet Mills was waiting for me in a conference room, along with Dr. Walsh and a man I didn't recognize, tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate lawyer. The setup felt like an ambush, designed to intimidate me into backing down. Ms. Torres, please sit. This is Charles Brennan from our legal department. We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention. Brennan. The name hit me like a physical blow. I looked more closely at the lawyer, noting the sharp features, the blonde hair, the way he carried himself with casual arrogance. Are you related to Natasha Brennan? Charles Brennan smiled, and it was the same cold expression I'd seen on my sister's face 100 times. Natasha is my wife, and she's told me some very interesting things about your recent behavior. The room suddenly felt airless. My sister had married this man 2 years ago, right around the time Torres Associated Medical Consulting had been established, the same period when Dr. Walsh had started talking about administrative credentials and MBA requirements for vendor relationships. Dr. Walsh, I said slowly, when you mentioned that the hospital needed someone with administrative credentials to interface with vendors, who exactly were you referring to? Dr. Walsh glanced nervously at Charles Brennan before answering. We brought in external consulting help to manage the more complex vendor relationships, someone with the proper educational background and legal expertise. External consulting. You mean Torres Associated Medical Consulting? The silence in the room was deafening. Charles Brennan cleared his throat, his lawyer mask slipping slightly. Miss Torres, we're here to discuss your employment with the hospital, not to play guessing games about consulting firms. My employment or my business? Because according to the contracts I've seen, C. Torres has been managing multi-million-dollar programs for this hospital, while Camila Torres, the nurse, has been making $48,000 a year. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? Dr. Walsh was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Charles maintained his professional composure. What you're describing sounds like a misunderstanding about administrative procedures. Sometimes nurses contribute to program development without realizing the scope of their involvement. Sometimes nurses unknowingly run multi-million-dollar consulting businesses while their brothers-in-law handle the legal and financial aspects. Charles's facade finally cracked, just for a moment, but it was enough. I saw the flash of panic in his eyes, the quick calculation of someone who'd been caught in something they couldn't easily explain. Miss Torres, I think you're confused about... I'm confused about how my sister's husband became the legal representative for a consulting business that uses my name and my expertise. I'm confused about how my work innovations somehow became the intellectual property of a company I've never heard of. And I'm confused about how my family has been calling me a failure while profiting from my success. Janet Mills looked back and forth between us, obviously realizing she was witnessing something much more complex than simple employment irregularities. Perhaps we should postpone this meeting until everyone has had a chance to review the relevant documentation. No, I said firmly. I think we should discuss this right now. Charles, I'd like to know exactly what role you've played in managing Torres Associated Medical Consulting, and Dr. Walsh, I'd like to know how long you've been aware that my work was being used to generate revenue for external consulting firms. Charles stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. Ms. Torres, any further communication should go through proper legal channels. Dr. Walsh, I recommend placing Ms. Torres on administrative leave pending a full investigation into these allegations. What allegations? The allegation that I've been unknowingly successful? The allegation that my work has value beyond what you've been paying me? Or the allegation that my own family has been stealing from me while convincing me I'm worthless? Charles was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to escape. Natasha warned me you might have a breakdown. She said you've been acting erratically, making up stories about being wealthy, refusing to accept reality. This conversation confirms her concerns about your mental state. The gaslighting was so blatant, so perfectly executed, that I almost admired the technique. Paint the victim as mentally unstable, dismiss their legitimate concerns as delusions, and use their own family's betrayal as evidence of their unfitness to handle the truth. Dr. Walsh, I said, ignoring Charles entirely, I'll be taking indefinite leave starting immediately, and I'll be consulting with my own attorneys about how to recover 6 years of stolen compensation and intellectual property. Camila, please don't do anything rash. We can work something out, find a solution that benefits everyone. The solution is simple. I want full documentation of every contract, every program, and every financial transaction that has involved my name or my work. And I want Charles Brennan to explain exactly how he became involved in managing a business that uses my professional identity. Charles paused at the door, turning back with that same cold smile. Miss Torres, I think you'll find that legally challenging any of these arrangements will be very difficult, especially when your own family is prepared to testify about your mental instability and inability to handle financial responsibilities.
There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. They weren't just stealing my professional identity, they were prepared to destroy my personal credibility to protect their scheme. My own sister was willing to declare me mentally incompetent to continue profiting from my work. Charles, I said calmly, I think you underestimate what I'm capable of when I finally understand what I'm fighting for. As he left the room, I realized that this wasn't just about money or career advancement anymore. This was about a systematic campaign to keep me small, to convince me I was ordinary while profiting from my extraordinary abilities. And it involved not just strangers or colleagues, but the people who were supposed to love me most. I sat in my Honda in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes after leaving that meeting, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The full scope of what I was facing was finally becoming clear, and it was overwhelming. This wasn't just professional theft or family betrayal. It was a coordinated conspiracy that had been operating for years, designed to keep me powerless while everyone around me profited from my work. My phone buzzed with another text from Derek. Camila, we're all coming over at 2 p.m., whether you like it or not. This has gone far enough. You need help, and we're going to make sure you get it. Make sure I get it.
like I was a child who couldn't make decisions for herself, like I was mentally incompetent and needed to be managed by my family. The same family that had been stealing from me, gaslighting me, and now planned to have me declared unstable to protect their financial interests. I thought about running. I could empty my savings account, get in my car, and drive somewhere they'd never find me. Start over in a different state, maybe change my name, leave this whole mess behind. For a moment, the idea was tempting. Escape the confrontation, avoid the fight, just disappear and try to build a quiet life somewhere else. But then I remembered Thomas's office, the contracts spread across that mahogany table, the website for Torres Associated Medical Consulting featuring testimonials about my work. I remembered Margaret's words, "You're not unfit, honey, you're surviving." I thought about Mrs. Chen and her apple pie, about the families I'd helped at the hospital, about little Lucy Chen who could safely get to dialysis because I'd figured out how to modify a transport vehicle. I was done running. I was done letting other people define my worth, my capabilities, the right to the life I'd built with my own hands. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. I called Thomas first. His assistant put me through immediately, and his voice was warm but concerned when he answered. "Camila, how did the hospital meeting go?" "It was educational." "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What would it take to prove legal ownership of Torres Associated Medical Consulting?" There was a pause, and I could hear him shuffling papers. "That's a complex question. If someone has been using your identity to establish business relationships, we need to prove that you're the real C. Torres behind the work. Do you have documentation of your innovations, your communications with vendors, evidence of your involvement in the projects?" "I have 6 years of patient records, program development notes, and email correspondence about every major initiative the consulting business has taken credit for. I have detailed documentation of every vehicle specification, every protocol improvement, every cost-saving measure they've claimed as their own." That's a start. We'd also need to establish timeline evidence, show that your work preceded their business filings, demonstrate that their success was built on your intellectual property. I thought about the flash drive in my purse, the one where I'd been backing up my work files for years out of habit. Every patient care plan, every protocol revision, every innovative solution, all time-stamped, all bearing my original notes and thoughts. I have that too. Thomas, what would happen if the real C. Torres wanted to dissolve the consulting business and start fresh? If you can prove you're the legitimate C. Torres, you'd have the right to terminate any contracts established in your name, recover any assets generated by your work, and pursue legal action against anyone who's been using your identity fraudulently, even if those people include family members. Thomas's voice was gentle but firm, especially if those people include family members. Using someone's identity for financial gain is fraud, regardless of the relationship. After I hung up with Thomas, I called Margaret. I needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who could remind me that I wasn't crazy, that what was happening to me was real and wrong and worth fighting against. "Sweetheart," she said when I explained the hospital meeting, "they're scared. When people build their success on lies, they'll do anything to protect those lies, even if it means destroying the person they've been lying about." "Margaret, my family is planning an intervention this afternoon. They want to convince everyone I'm having a mental breakdown so they can continue stealing from me. Are you going to let them into your apartment?"
The question was simple, but it felt revolutionary. Was I going to let them into my space, my sanctuary, to continue their campaign of manipulation and control? Was I going to sit quietly while they told me I was delusional, unstable, incapable of understanding my own life? "No," I said, and the word felt like a door slamming shut on 6 years of accepting less than I deserved. "No, I'm not." "Good. What are you going to do instead?" I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired, stressed, but not broken. Not anymore. I'm going to prepare for war. The next 3 hours were the most productive of my entire adult life. I drove to Thomas's office and spent an hour with his legal team, copying every document, every contract, every piece of evidence that proved my identity and my work. Then I went to a private investigator Margaret had recommended, a woman named Sarah Klein, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Sarah was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made you trust her immediately. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally taking notes, never once acting like what I was describing was impossible or unlikely. Financial fraud for business purposes is more common than people think, she said when I finished, especially when the victim is someone who doesn't have a strong sense of their own professional worth. The perpetrators count on the victim feeling too small or too confused to fight back. Can you help me prove what they've done? I can do better than that. I can help you build a case that will not only prove what they've done, but ensure they face serious consequences for it. Financial fraud, identity theft, conspiracy? These are federal crimes, Miss Torres. Your family and the hospital didn't just steal money from you. They committed felonies. Sarah handed me a business card and a thick folder. This contains instructions for documenting everything, every conversation, every threat, every attempt to discredit you. From now on, you're not just defending yourself, you're building a case. By the time I got home, it was almost 2 o'clock. I could see Derek's car already parked outside my apartment building, along with Aunt Linda's SUV. They were early, probably hoping to catch me off guard, to start their intervention before I had time to prepare. I sat in my car for a moment, looking up at my apartment windows, knowing that my family was probably already inside. Derek had kept a spare key from when he'd helped me move in 5 years ago. They were in my space, going through my things, preparing their arguments about why I needed to be managed and controlled for my own good. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. Then I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward my building. For the first time in my life, I was going into a family confrontation as an equal, armed with evidence and the knowledge of my own worth. They wanted an intervention. Fine, but it wasn't going to go the way they'd planned. This time, I was ready for them. This time, I knew exactly who I was and what I was fighting for. And this time, I had proof. I walked into my apartment to find them sitting in my living room like they owned the place. Natasha was on my couch, perfectly made up despite the emotional gravity of their supposed intervention, scrolling through her phone with that bored expression she wore when she had to deal with inconvenient family obligations. Derek was in my kitchen, eating food from my refrigerator without permission, while Aunt Linda sat in my reading chair, holding a folder that probably contained pamphlets about mental health facilities. They looked up when I entered, and I saw the calculation in their eyes, the quick assessments of my demeanor, the evaluation of how difficult this was going to be. They were expecting the same Camila who had always backed down, who had always apologized for taking up space, who had always accepted their version of reality over her own perceptions. "There she is," Derek said, his mouth full of my leftover Chinese food. "We were starting to worry you were going to make us wait all day." "How did you get into my apartment?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Derek held up a key ring. "I still had your spare key. Good thing too, since you've been ignoring everyone's calls. We needed to make sure you hadn't done something stupid." Something stupid? Like standing up for myself. Like refusing to accept abuse. Like discovering that I was worth more than they had ever allowed me to believe. "Camila, honey, please sit down," Aunt Linda said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We're all here because we love you and we're worried about you." I remained standing, my phone recording in my pocket, my hand resting casually on my purse where I'd placed copies of the most damning documents. Worried about what, exactly? Natasha finally looked up from her phone, and her expression was a masterpiece of manufactured sympathy. "Cam, we know you've been under a lot of stress lately. Derek told us about the weird stories you've been telling people about running some secret business. And Charles said you had some kind of breakdown at the hospital yesterday."
Charles, her husband, the man who'd been using my identity to build a consulting empire while I lived paycheck to paycheck. The man who was never prepared to declare me mentally incompetent to protect their scheme. What stories would those be, Natasha? Come on, sissy. You know what stories. You've been telling people you're some kind of millionaire business owner, that you've been secretly running a consulting company. It's obviously a stress reaction to feeling inadequate about your life. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could see how it had worked for so long. Take the victim's legitimate discoveries and reframe them as delusions. Make their accurate perceptions sound like symptoms of mental illness. Use their own family's concern as proof that they couldn't trust their own judgment. Derek told me you even convinced some stranger at a car dealership that you're successful, Natasha continued. Honey, I was there. I saw how you reacted when I made that little joke about your car. Normal people don't have complete breakdowns over harmless teasing. Harmless teasing? That's what she was calling the public humiliation that had started this whole chain of discoveries. The cruelty that had led me to understand how thoroughly I'd been exploited and manipulated. Natasha, I said calmly, what's the name of your husband's consulting business? The question caught her off guard. I saw her eyes flick quickly to Derek, then back to me. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious. You married a successful lawyer who runs a consulting business, right? What's it called? Camila, we're not here to discuss Charles's work. We're here to discuss your mental health. Derek stood up from the kitchen counter, wiping his hands on one of my dish towels. Yeah, Cam, you're deflecting. This is exactly what Linda was talking about. You can't stay focused on reality. You keep making up these elaborate conspiracy theories instead of dealing with your actual problems. My actual problems? Like what? Aunt Linda opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Like the fact that you're 32 years old, living in a studio apartment, driving a car that should have been scrapped years ago, and working a job that barely pays your bills. Instead of facing those realities and making positive changes, you're creating fantasy scenarios where you're secretly wealthy and successful. The irony was breathtaking. I was living in a studio apartment and driving an old car because I'd been giving money to my family for years while someone else collected the salary for work I'd been doing. I was financially struggling because the people in this room had been systematically stealing from me while convincing me I had no value. So your solution is what, exactly? Put me in a mental health facility so I can get the help I obviously need? If that's what it takes, Derek said. We've already talked to someone about having you evaluated, for your own safety. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. They weren't here for an intervention. They were here to neutralize me before I could expose what they'd been doing. The mental health evaluation wasn't about concern for my well-being. It was about having me declared incompetent so they could continue profiting from my work without interference. That's interesting, I said, pulling out my phone and stopping the recording. Because I've been talking to some people too. I opened my purse and pulled out the folder of documents, spreading them across my coffee table. The Torres Associated Medical Consulting Contracts, the hospital agreements, the vehicle fleet specifications, the financial records showing millions of dollars in revenue generated by my innovations. The silence in the room was deafening. Natasha's face had gone pale, and Derek was staring at the documents like they might spontaneously combust. Aunt Linda was the first to recover, though her voice was tight with something that might have been panic. Camila, I don't know where you got these papers, but creating fake documents is a sign of serious mental illness. This just proves that you need professional help. Fake documents, Linda. These are contracts from Hartwell Automotive Solutions, one of the largest fleet management companies in New England. They show 6 years of business relationships with Torres Associated Medical Consulting, a company that's been using my name and my expertise to generate over $2 million in annual revenue. I pulled out the hospital agreements next. These are agreements between Millbrook General Hospital and the same consulting company showing that C. Torres has been managing multi-million-dollar programs while Camila Torres, the nurse, has been making $48,000 a year. Derek was looking back and forth between the documents and Natasha, and I could see the moment when he started to understand the scope of what his sister had been doing. Nat, what is this? What the hell is going on? But Natasha had recovered her composure, and her expression was cold, calculating. Those documents don't prove anything, Camila. Anyone can create fake letterhead, fake contracts. The fact that you've gone to this much trouble to create an elaborate fraud just shows how far your delusions have progressed.
Delusions, I said, pulling out my final piece of evidence.
a business card for Torres Associated Medical Consulting, with Charles Brennan listed as legal counsel and Natasha Brennan listed as business development manager. Is this a delusion too? The business card hit the coffee table like a bomb. Derek stared at it, then at Natasha, his face cycling through confusion, understanding, and finally rage. You've been running a business using Camila's name? While telling everyone she's a failure? While borrowing money from her because you couldn't make ends meet? Natasha's mask finally slipped completely. It's not that simple, Derek. Camila had good ideas, but she didn't have the business skills to monetize them. We took her suggestions and turned them into something profitable. She should be grateful. Grateful, I repeated, for having my identity stolen, my work plagiarized, and my financial future destroyed while you convinced my entire family that I was worthless? You are worthless, Natasha snapped, all pretense of sisterly concern gone. You're a nurse who drives a piece of junk car and lives in a studio apartment. Without Charles and me, your little ideas would have stayed little ideas. We made you successful, even if you were too stupid to realize it. Aunt Linda was looking back and forth between us, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't about Camila's mental health. This was about a massive fraud that her niece had been perpetrating for years. Natasha, Linda said slowly, please tell me you didn't actually steal your sister's identity to start a business. I didn't steal anything, Natasha said, but her voice was defensive now, desperate. Camila works for a hospital. The hospital contracted with our consulting firm. It's all perfectly legal. Legal, I said, pulling out the final document, the power of attorney paperwork that Charles had filed, giving him the right to conduct business in my name. Paperwork I'd never signed, bearing a signature that was close to mine, but not quite right. Is forgery legal, Natasha? Is identity theft legal when it's your own sister? The room fell silent as everyone stared at the forged signature. Even Derek, who had been loyal to Natasha through everything, was looking at his sister with something approaching horror. You forged her signature, he said quietly. Jesus Christ, Nat! You forged her signature and stole her identity and made us all think she was the problem? Natasha stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by someone who's clearly having a psychotic break. I'm not going to sit here and listen to these accusations. Actually, I said, holding up my phone, you are going to sit here. Because everything you've said for the last 20 minutes has been recorded, and it's going straight to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The word FBI hit the room like a physical blow. Natasha sank back onto the couch, her face white with terror. Derek was staring at me with something that might have been respect for the first time in our adult lives. Camila, Aunt Linda said weakly, maybe we can work this out as a family. Maybe there's no need to involve law enforcement. The time for working this out as a family ended when you all decided I was mentally ill rather than listen to what I was trying to tell you. The FBI is already involved. So is the IRS. Turns out when you steal someone's identity to run a multi-million-dollar business, there are a lot of agencies that want to have conversations with you. Natasha was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who'd been caught and was facing consequences for the first time in her life. Camila, please, I'm your sister. We can fix this. We can make this right. I looked at her sitting on my couch, finally seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Not the successful sister I'd always tried to live up to, not the family member I'd sacrificed everything to support, but a criminal who had systematically destroyed my life while convincing me I was lucky to have her in it. No, Natasha, I said quietly. We really can't. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the conference room at the FBI's Hartford field office, watching Special Agent Marina Rivera spread out financial documents that painted a picture of fraud so extensive it made my own discoveries look modest by comparison. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, probably because Charles and Natasha had been sloppy in their confidence that I'd never figure out what they'd done. Ms. Torres, Agent Rivera said, pointing to a spreadsheet showing wire transfers and business transactions, we've traced over $3.2 million that was generated using your identity and expertise over the past 4 years. That doesn't include the hospital contracts and the additional consulting work done under your name. The tax implications alone are staggering, the IRS representative, David Chen, added. Torres Associated Medical Consulting has been filing returns and claiming business deductions while the actual C. Torres received none of the income. The tax evasion charges will likely carry the heaviest sentences.
Agent Rivera turned to another page in her file. We executed search warrants on both Charles Brennan's law office and the Torres Associated business offices yesterday. What we found was a systematic operation designed to exploit your professional expertise while keeping you financially dependent and unaware of your own value. She showed me photographs of filing cabinets full of documents, computer hard drives, and business records. Your sister and her husband had detailed files on your work, your innovations, your patient care protocols. They'd been monitoring your professional activities and turning your ideas into billable consulting services almost immediately after you implemented them at the hospital. They were watching me, I said, though it wasn't really a question. The scope of the surveillance was becoming clear. Every innovation I'd suggested in staff meetings, every protocol I developed for patient care, every efficiency improvement I'd recommended had been documented and monetized. More than watching, Agent Rivera said. We found recordings of hospital meetings where you'd proposed new programs, detailed notes about your conversations with vendors, even photographs of your handwritten patient care plans. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was systematic intellectual property theft. Ellen Vasquez leaned forward. Camila, what they did to you goes beyond simple identity theft. They created an entire business ecosystem designed to harvest your expertise while keeping you believing you were just a staff nurse. The psychological manipulation aspect of this case is unprecedented. Thomas nodded. We've also discovered that Torres Associated Medical Consulting had been bidding on contracts with hospitals across New England, always using your innovations and protocols as their competitive advantage. They won a $1.8 million contract with Hartford Regional specifically because they could offer patient transport solutions that no other consulting firm could match. Solutions I developed, I said. Solutions you developed, Agent Rivera confirmed. And here's the part that's going to interest you most. When we arrested Charles Brennan yesterday, he immediately tried to make a deal. He's claiming that Natasha was the mastermind, that he was just providing legal support for what he thought was a legitimate consulting business. I felt a cold satisfaction at that news. Charles throwing Natasha under the bus was poetic justice, considering how quickly they'd both been willing to have me declared mentally incompetent to protect their scheme. What about Natasha? She's being held without bail. When we executed the search warrant at her apartment, we found detailed psychological profiles she'd compiled about you, including strategies for keeping you feeling insecure and financially dependent. She had actually written out scripts for family conversations designed to undermine your confidence. The room fell silent as that information sank in. Natasha hadn't just been stealing my professional identity, she'd been conducting a psychological warfare campaign to ensure I never discovered my own worth or questioned the family dynamic that kept me vulnerable to exploitation. Agent Rivera opened another file. We also found evidence that Dr. Patricia Walsh at Millbrook General was aware of the consulting arrangement and was being compensated for facilitating access to your work. She'll be facing charges as well. Dr. Walsh was in on it? She received quarterly payments from Torres Associated Medical Consulting listed as administrative consulting fees. Essentially, she was being paid to give Charles and Natasha access to your innovations and to ensure you remain in a position where your work could be easily monitored and stolen. Thomas shook his head. The level of betrayal here is staggering. Your own supervisor, your own family, they all conspired to keep you believing you were ordinary while building a business empire on your extraordinary abilities. Ellen Vasquez pulled out a different set of documents. Now for the good news.
We've frozen all assets associated with Taurus Associated Medical Consulting, including business accounts, real estate purchases, and personal assets that can be traced to the fraudulent income. Preliminary estimates suggest you're entitled to recovery of approximately $3.2 million, plus punitive damages, plus interest. $3.2 million. The number felt surreal. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment, driving a 15-year-old car convinced that I was a financial failure who couldn't afford to live the life my successful sister took for granted. Now I was learning that my ideas, my work, and my expertise had generated millions of dollars that had been stolen from me while I was made to feel worthless. There's more, Agent Rivera said. We've been contacted by 17 hospitals across New England who want to discuss legitimate consulting contracts with you directly. Once word got out about the investigation, it became clear that the real C. Taurus was the person they'd actually wanted to work with all along. David Chen from the IRS leaned forward. Ms. Torres, you'll also be entitled to significant tax refunds. Because you weren't receiving the income that was being reported under your name, you were essentially paying taxes on money you never saw. The IRS will be issuing refunds for the past 4 years with interest. What happens now? I asked. Ellen Vasquez smiled. Now you get to decide what kind of life you want to build. You have the financial resources to start your own legitimate consulting business, to pursue advanced education if you want it, to live anywhere you choose. You're free.
Free. The word felt strange and wonderful. Free from the family dynamics that had kept me small, free from the financial constraints that had forced me to accept less than I deserved, free from the self-doubt that had been systematically cultivated to keep me from recognizing my own value. There is one more thing, Agent Rivera said, her expression becoming more serious. Your family members who weren't directly involved in the fraud, Derek, your Aunt Linda, your cousins, they've all been trying to contact you. Some have been calling our office. I thought about Derek's voicemails filled with apologetic rambling about how he'd had no idea what Natasha was doing, how sorry he was for not believing me, how the family wanted to make things right. I thought about Aunt Linda's tearful calls, begging me to forgive them for being manipulated by Natasha's lies. What are they saying? That they want to apologize, that they were deceived by Natasha, just like you were, that they hope you can forgive them and maintain family relationships. Thomas looked at me carefully. Camila, you don't owe them anything. Not forgiveness, not relationship, not even a conversation. What they did to you during that intervention attempt was unforgivable, regardless of whether they knew about the fraud. He was right. Even if Derek and Linda hadn't known about the consulting business, they'd still been willing to have me declared mentally ill rather than listen to what I was trying to tell them. They'd still chosen Natasha's version of reality over mine, still participated in the campaign to convince me I was delusional and unstable. I don't think I'm ready for family reconciliation, I said. Maybe someday, but not now. Agent Rivera nodded. That's completely understandable. You've been through a severe trauma and you have every right to protect yourself while you recover. What about Natasha and Charles? When will they be sentenced? The trial will probably begin in about 6 months. Given the amount of money involved and the sophistication of the fraud, they're both looking at significant federal prison time. Charles could get 15 to 20 years, and Natasha could get 12 to 15. 12 to 15 years! My sister, who had humiliated me in a car dealership for driving an old Honda while she shot for a Mercedes with money she'd stolen from me, was going to spend the next decade or more in federal prison. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so devastating. As we wrapped up the meeting and prepared to leave, Agent Rivera handed me one final document. This is a victim impact statement form. If you choose to fill it out, it will be read at their sentencing hearing. You can describe how their actions affected your life, your relationships, your sense of self. It's optional, but many victims find it helpful in the healing process.
I took the form, thinking about everything I might want to say to Natasha when she was finally held accountable for what she'd done, about the years I'd spent feeling like a failure while she built an empire on my work, about the humiliation in the car dealership, the family intervention, the systematic campaign to convince me I was delusional and unstable, about the life I'd lost and the life I was finally free to build. But mostly, I thought about how good it felt to finally know exactly what I was worth. 6 months later, I stood in the showroom of Riverside Luxury Motors, but this time, everything was different. I wasn't wearing scrubs and feeling out of place. I was dressed in a tailored business suit, holding the keys to my new BMW X5 and waiting for James Harrison to finish processing the paperwork for my purchase. The same James Harrison who had dismissed me so completely the night Natasha humiliated me here. "Miss Torres," he said, approaching with that same practiced smile, though now it carried genuine respect rather than calculated assessment. "Your vehicle is ready for delivery. I have to say, it's been a pleasure working with someone who knows exactly what they want." I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at my new car, midnight blue, loaded with every safety and medical equipment transport feature I'd specified. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I could finally afford the tools that would make my work more efficient and effective. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, I have a confession to make. We've met before." His smile faltered slightly, confusion crossing his face as he tried to place me. I could see him mentally scrolling through his customer database, trying to remember when he might have helped me before. "About 8 months ago, I came here with my sister. I was wearing scrubs, driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic. You told me your time wasn't worth wasting on someone who couldn't afford a down payment on a used Corolla." The blood drained from his face as the memory came flooding back. I watched him remember that night. The woman in scrubs, the cruel sister, the dismissive treatment he had given to someone who he had assumed had no money and no value. "Miss Torres, I don't know what to say. That was completely unprofessional of me. I should never have."
Mr. Harrison, I interrupted gently, I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because I understand something now that I didn't understand then. People's worth isn't determined by what they drive or what they wear or how they present themselves to the world. Sometimes the most valuable people are the ones who've been convinced they have no value at all. He nodded, still looking mortified. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I've thought about that night many times since then. It wasn't my finest moment. No, it wasn't, but it was exactly what I needed to happen. Because it was true. That humiliation had been the catalyst for everything that followed. My discovery of Thomas Hartwell's kindness, the revelation about my stolen identity, the investigation that brought down Natasha and Charles, and ultimately, my understanding of my own worth. As I drove my new car home, I thought about how much had changed in just 6 months. I'd moved out of my studio apartment into a beautiful townhouse in West Hartford, complete with a home office where I now ran Torres Medical Consulting, the legitimate version of the business that had been built on my work. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now actually doing the job I'd unknowingly been doing for years, except this time I was getting paid what it was worth. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway, and Margaret Hartwell's warm voice filled the car through the Bluetooth system. "Camila, darling, how did the car pickup go?" "Perfectly. Mr. Harrison was very professional, very respectful. He even remembered me from before." I bet that was an uncomfortable conversation for him. "Actually, it was fine. I'm not angry anymore, Margaret. Not at him, not at the dealership, not even at my family. I understand now that their treatment of me was never really about me. It was about their own insecurities and limitations." "That's very wise, sweetheart. How are you feeling about the sentencing hearing next week?" Next week, Natasha and Charles would finally be sentenced for their crimes. The trial had been a media sensation, partly because the scope of the fraud was so extensive, but mostly because the story of family betrayal and identity theft had captured public attention. I'd been contacted by 3 different production companies about selling the rights to my story, though I hadn't decided whether I wanted that level of public exposure. "I'm ready," I said. "I finished my victim impact statement yesterday." I'd spent weeks writing and rewriting that statement, trying to capture not just the financial damage they'd done, but the psychological trauma of being systematically convinced that I was worthless while they profited from my extraordinary abilities. In the end, I'd settled on something simple and honest, a description of the woman I'd been 8 months ago, driving to that car dealership in scrubs and feeling ashamed of my old Honda, and the woman I was now, finally understanding that my value had never been determined by their opinions of me. Thomas and I will be there to support you. You don't have to face this alone, Margaret Hartwell said. Thomas and I had become more than business partners. They'd become the family I chose, the people who valued me for who I really was, rather than what they could extract from me. Thomas's business partnership had evolved into something much more significant. He'd offered me a position as co-owner of Hartwell Automotive Solutions, recognizing that my medical expertise, combined with his business acumen, could revolutionize healthcare transportation across the country. As I walked into my house, I passed the framed photo on my hallway table, a picture of me receiving the Healthcare Innovation Award from the New England Medical Association last month. The award recognized my contributions to patient care transportation and community health services, contributions that were finally being credited to the right person. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek. Saw your interview in Healthcare Business Weekly. Really proud of what you've accomplished. Hope someday we can talk. Derek had been trying to rebuild our relationship for months, and part of me appreciated his efforts. He'd testified against Natasha during the trial, admitting that he'd been complicit in the family's treatment of me, even if he hadn't known about the fraud. But I wasn't ready for family reconciliation yet. Maybe someday, but not while I was still learning how to live without the weight of their expectations and judgments. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my deck, looking out over the garden I'd planted last month. For the first time in my adult life, I had time for hobbies, for interests that weren't related to work or family obligations or financial survival. I'd taken up painting, enrolled in a creative writing class, and started volunteering at a shelter for women escaping domestic violence. Mrs. Chen still lived next door to my old apartment, and I visited her every week, bringing groceries and helping with her medications. She'd been one of the first people to congratulate me when the story broke in the local news, and she'd cried when I told her how her simple kindness had meant so much to me during the darkest period of my life.
"I always knew you were special, dear," she'd said. "I could see it in how you cared for people, how you never thought about yourself first. Money doesn't make someone valuable. Kindness does." As the sun set over my garden, I thought about the woman I'd been 8 months ago, standing in that car dealership, believing my sister's assessment that I was too poor and unsuccessful to belong in her world. That woman had been so much more than she knew. Brilliant, innovative, compassionate, valuable beyond measure. She just hadn't had anyone in her life who could see her clearly enough to reflect that worth back to her. Now, I surrounded myself with people who valued what I really brought to the world: my expertise, my compassion, my ability to solve complex problems and improve people's lives. I'd learned to choose relationships that built me up rather than tore me down, to set boundaries that protected my peace rather than preserved other people's comfort. My phone rang one more time before I went inside for the night. The caller ID showed unknown number, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I remembered that I didn't have to be afraid of phone calls anymore. Didn't have to worry about family drama or manipulation or people trying to convince me I was less than I was. Hello? Miss Torres, this is Dr. Amanda Foster from Johns Hopkins Medical Center. I've been following your work in healthcare logistics, and I was wondering if you might be interested in discussing a consulting opportunity with our hospital system. We've been struggling with patient transport efficiency, and your innovations are exactly what we need. I smiled, looking at my garden, my house, my life that I'd finally learned to value properly. Dr. Foster, I'd be very interested in that conversation. When would be a good time for you? As I scheduled the appointment and ended the call,
I realized that this was what success actually looked like. Not a luxury car or expensive clothes or the approval of people who didn't really know you, but the freedom to use your gifts in service of work that mattered, surrounded by people who appreciated your true worth. 8 months ago, my sister had called my car cheap and made me feel worthless in front of strangers. Today, I drove a BMW and knew exactly what I was worth. But the real transformation wasn't in what I owned. It was in finally understanding that I had always been valuable, even when I was the only one who couldn't see it.